Geez, it does look good, doesn't it? Really good.
The Nissen huts at Belmont North are important in what they reveal about the migrant experience in the post-war period. They're also interesting in terms of the use of a prefabricated building type and a transportable building type, which were really prominent themes in architecture and engineering after World War II when there was a serious housing shortage. And the fact that those remaining Nissen huts are still there has the potential to reveal quite a lot about what life was like in that period. And the fact that so many of them have been demolished or destroyed means that that period in Australian history can quite easily be lost or diminished without ever having been studied in any great detail. Nissen huts were invented by Peter Nissen in 1916 during World War I to provide rapidly erected temporary field accommodation, mostly in theatres of war. One of the major attractions of them was that you didn't require any building skills or any trade skills to erect one in the field. They came in a crate, everything came pre-cut, and it was almost like a sort of Meccano set job putting them together. And they were easily assembled in less than a day. In fact, I believe the record for putting one together is a maximum of 2 hours. So they weren't intended to be permanent. You know, they were really intended as temporary field accommodation. Over time, they were pressed into service for a range of other uses, other types of temporary accommodation. There's a cluster of Nissen huts at Belmont North, which were built in the early 1950s to provide temporary migrant accommodation. Originally, there were 50 Nissen huts in that outdoor hostel, of which 23 now remain.
It was a good old house in Pommy Town. We had a lot of bush around us, we had a lot of fun. It was a good place to grow up. It was a cluster, so this wasn't one house that stood out, it was a cluster. And other kids would say, "Oh, yeah, you're a Pom, are you?" I say, "No, I'm not real, I'm not." Well, I suppose I am, yeah. But I always liked the name Pommy Town too. The actual name was Commonwealth Cottages. Then everyone just called them Pommy Town. And other people recognise them as Nissen huts. We never called them Nissen huts, we just called it Pommy Town, or the cottages. Some of the children's family come from England. No one was rich that lived here, we're all just, like my father was a miner, and the kids, I mean, we were Pommy Town kids. I suppose when I went to school, they'd say, "Oh, do you live in a damn sketty tin or something," you know, which didn't go down very well. And people started buying them. Some have been pulled down.
The Historic Houses Trust bought the Nissen hut in Somerset Street in 2008 through its Endangered Houses Fund program, which was a revolving conservation fund set up by the Trust to acquire historic properties at risk, to conserve or restore or adapt them, and then to put them back on the market and sell them back to private owners. And it was based on the idea that the state couldn't continue to acquire more and more historic places and run them all as museums. So the Nissen hut's quite an interesting departure from the other properties that the Endangered Houses Fund tackled, because they were mostly early colonial houses, which were really seriously at risk. And they were also often in rural or semi-rural areas. The Nissen hut, by contrast, is a post-war industrial building in a suburb of Newcastle. And I think the Trust might have felt at the time that that sort of local heritage was really easily overlooked. And so quite an important aspect of Australia's social history might be destroyed or erased permanently, unless at least one example was saved. In the course of acquiring the property and doing research, of course, we discovered that there are still other enclaves of Nissen huts from the same period in different parts of Australia, including in the Lower Hunter Valley, where there are another 50 or so in Cessnock and East Maitland, also several in Victoria. So they're not totally at risk of disappearing, but they are mostly either abandoned or neglected. And so they're If they've got cultural significance, and we obviously think they do have cultural significance, that significance is easily lost or diminished if they continue to be demolished or altered insensitively. When the Trust bought the Nissen hut, it hadn't been occupied for quite some time and it was already in an extremely dilapidated condition. And there were several years before we finally locked on the scheme we've now implemented, a conservation style approach of trying to retain as much of the original fabric as possible and trying to retain the integrity of the form, the three-dimensional form of the building on the site and its relationship with other properties rather than dismantling everything and reconstructing everything.
It's one of those projects that when you first walk up to it at first glance you sort of think, oh, what have I got myself into? But this is only sort of our second week here, and you know, like any sort of buildings, if you don't sort of get to know them and talk to them and find out what they're like, and if you don't sort of apply yourself in a way that you've got to be proud of what you're doing here and how you've come along with the build. So we like to put a bit in and we like to see what we get out at the end, which is, you know, the reward of reinstating a beautiful old building.
Characteristic of that idea of temporary and transportable buildings, the Nissen hut substructure uses precast concrete piers, which I think are about 6 inches in imperial, so 150 millimetres square, pretty minimal for a reinforced concrete pier, and up to 1.8 metres high, not bedded in the ground to any great depth. But the majority of those were in really good condition, so the engineer allowed us just to retain them all.
The building itself is surprisingly reasonably sound, I guess. It's actually quite square for a building this vintage, like back in the 1950s it was built, so they did a good job, I guess, back in the day. I think there is some structural issues where it's slowly falling away, which is kind of expected, which we're trying to deal with at the moment, but all in all, it's actually done well.
What was really interesting was the subfloor area and the floor structure itself were actually very, very robust and in very good condition because they're built so high off the ground, and all that subfloor structure was all made of Oregon, which is incredibly tough termite resistant timber. So a surprisingly high quality construction of the floor to then put this tin shed on top of.
We're currently undergoing the demolition process, which is the removal of the existing materials which we are trying to keep and reinstate as much as we can. We've got quite a lot of dilapidation as far as the building materials are concerned. Throughout the process, she doesn't look like much now, we'll admit, although we're transforming this old girl into a new beautiful piece of work.
And the big ticket item, I guess, on this kind of build is the roofing. Custom wall roofing, it's seen better days, so it's probably in a lot worse condition than we expected. The corrugated iron, it's actually, it's an old Colorbond product by Lysart. The way it's been done, it's done in a few parts, 5 different rows of sheeting joined on the purlins, which over time the joins have all rusted out and it's just eroding further and further along the sheet. So we kind of got that as a bit of an obstacle to deal with. To keep the heritage value, we kind of need to retain that, which is going to become quite challenging, I guess, when it comes to keeping the building watertight. So we're just looking at options at the moment. We've got a bit of work to do with all these T-bars and everything to bring it back to life. To be able to have the opportunity to be involved with something with such history really makes you want to conserve it as much as possible, rather than a lot of people, I guess, wouldn't even look twice at trying to take on a project like this. So it's quite interesting, and I can't wait to kind of do it justice too. So that'll be quite cool, I think. Yeah.
What was a surprise was how little structure there is, some steel ribs and some timber purlins, and it not held together with very much else. So that was a surprise in terms of how much additional work we needed to do to make a stable structure to work with.
This is the first building that I've had that has this curved shape and design. There's actually not a lot to these buildings, which is why they were built back in the day. They were really cheap to build and they were quite long lasting, as you can see by this still being here today. The curved shape in itself is actually very strong. Everything else inside of the building is held together mostly by its external frame.
Each arch is made up of 5 short segments that are bolted together, and they're anchored onto the floor with little steel feet and bolted in place. And at first sight you imagine that they're vertical and plumb, but the reality is once the sheet metal roof had been taken off, which was basically the stiffening that was holding it all in place, a bit like an eggshell, the ribs were all sort of crazy out of alignment. In some instances they're up to 70 or 80 millimetres out of alignment. And even though they make a half circle arc, none of the arcs are identical, they're all slightly different. So the builder, I think he wasn't planning to do this, but he had to put quite a lot of effort into propping everything, getting all the arches in alignment. The engineer working on this project, who was incredibly sympathetic to what we were trying to achieve, was also quite concerned about the structural integrity of the building. So he came up with the system of the welded flanges and welded angles that supported the purlins, and we also added additional timber purlins in the arch to stiffen up the whole frame, and they're all bolted in place onto welded on angle brackets, so everything's stiff and rigid and in alignment, basically so that the sheet metal roofing would sit perfectly on the arches and hold them all in place. The thing that's really noticeable about the Nissen huts in their original form is how poorly insulated they are. And, their environmental performance is terrible. Just without any amelioration, they're basically like little sardine tins, incredibly hot in summer and ice boxes in winter.
We had 2 Carol heaters because it used to get really cold. In summer it used to get extremely hot in the house. The masonite was just to the iron. You would swelter in here. The degrees would have been around the 40 mark. The house would heat up so much. It was hotter inside, I think, than outside at times. I used to get under the bed on the lino to escape the heat.
So one of the challenges of the project we did was how to get really high standard of insulation in the very thin space between the external sheet metal shell and the new internal lining. In a thickness of about 100 millimetres, we've got 4 layers of insulation of different character. We've got double-sided foil, then 2 layers of mineral wool and another layer of foil internally. So that actually changes the transmitted heat load into the building from outside in a really radical way and makes it really comfortable. I've been there, I was up there in January this year on a really hot day, like 31 degrees outside, and inside was really pleasant, low 20s, lovely breezes. You certainly didn't feel you needed air conditioning at all. It's a really very nice ambient environment to be in.
Well, it used to rain, and if it pelted down hard, it sounded great in the place. It really did. It's not like living in a tiled house, you've got to look out the window to see if it's raining. But here you knew when it started. When it come to bad weather, it held up good because it's round. Your square houses normally got their roofs blown off. These didn't blow off.
I had initially hoped to be able to salvage all of the old sheet metal roofing and reuse it with some clever new contemporary weatherproof shield. Now the reality was when we took all the roof sheeting off, it was so badly deteriorated it couldn't be reused. So we specified a new corrugated steel sheeting product with the same orb as the original, the same wave profile, which is not the standard modern profile. And I thought we would just buy it in flat sheets and have it rolled in a workshop and then delivered to the site. But our contractor came up with a really neat idea of having all the sheet metal delivered, and the machine actually curves it on site in one go. So instead of having 4 sheets going around the arch or the curve for the roof, there's a single sheet goes the entire length. So the single sheet's about 9 metres long to go over the curve. So there are no horizontal joins anywhere in the roof sheet, and there's just a vertical overlap at the end of every sheet. And the benefit of that is that there's no opportunity for water penetration anywhere. And water penetration had been the main deficiency of the building originally. The laps between the sheets were really small, really not sufficient for the sort of weather that you get on the east coast of Australia. And they led to the really extensive rusting and deterioration of the sheet metal. So that will never happen with the new roof sheeting. And then on the day, that's actually quite exciting because the stuff was delivered and rolled, and then there was a little crane lifted everything in place, and they all fitted sort of more or less perfectly with a crew on the roof and on the ground, positioning them and then just bolting them in place as they went. So I think the whole roof took about 3 hours to install, which is just an amazing thing to see. And with a similar colour, the original roof sheeting had been painted many times, so the new roof sheeting's painted a similar colour to what we found there. We wanted to maintain the three-dimensional integrity of the Nissan hut in its original form. So really a very modest little tin shed, 6 metres wide and about 13 or 14 metres long. But we also realised that the footprint's actually very small, and in order to get a reasonable standard of contemporary residential accommodation, we probably need to add something on. And so of particular consideration was what an addition might look like from the street. And when we started talking to the heritage planner at Lake Macquarie Council, she was very concerned that as far as possible you shouldn't be aware at all of an addition to the Nissan hut when looking at the building from the street. You should just see as far as possible the original structure. So we started playing around with different three-dimensional forms for additions, and what we ended up with was a curved sheet metal clad little building separated by a glazed breezeway, so completely detached from the original building. And the idea of that actually came from looking at corrugated iron water tanks that you often see attached to old houses, and playing with the idea of a custom orb, bright sheet metal, corrugated sheet metal shed attached to the back of the building, and then different configurations of that, which led to the form that's currently there now. And we were really aware of the need for it to be able to find a buyer on the market. So it has to have a reasonable standard of residential comfort and amenity, which probably we thought it ought to have one really good bedroom and one really nice bathroom and a laundry and the sort of things that people expect as sort of basic amenities in contemporary houses. And so we put all of that in the new extension at the rear. What that left was inside the original building, this beautiful barrel vaulted space. So we've ended up with a sort of open plan living and dining area that's sort of 6 metres wide and 8.5 metres long, full height, with beautiful light on 3 sides, and a really fantastic sort of flexible contemporary living area with doors opening out onto a terrace and a view out to the ocean. So a really nice combination of old and new juxtaposed.
When the houses started getting pulled down, I thought it was a bit sad, really. So hopefully they don't pull them all down, and that people that live around here take a good look at this place and what you can do to it, and they can renovate it in the same kind of way to keep the home.
The Nissan huts at Belmont North don't have any heritage protection, and so they're actually quite vulnerable. And in the 12 years or so since Historic Houses Trust bought the one in Somerset Street, 10 or 11 have been demolished. So they can be demolished or really insensitively remodelled without any limitations on them, unfortunately. Interestingly, in 2008, when the Trust purchased the Nissen hut, and there was a move by Lake Macquarie Council to list the entire precinct and to do a precinct listing for the remaining Nissen huts at Belmont North, it was really strongly rejected by the local community, and so ultimately it didn't proceed. And so that's I think a very interesting local community perspective on what qualifies as heritage or not. And I think in many people's minds, heritage is still stuff that happened a really long time ago. You know, it's 19th century or early colonial, and not necessarily something that's still in living memory for people. But those little houses were built in 1951 to 1953. They're already 70 years old, and at risk of all disappearing eventually, unless there's some local recognition of their significance. So hopefully the project that we've done triggers people to think slightly differently about them. And certainly while the builder's been on site for the last 10 months or so, he's had a lot of interest from local people, including quite a few other owners of Nissen huts who've all said, oh, I didn't realise you could do this. I didn't realise this is the sort of thing you could do. So hopefully the project that we've done slightly changes people's perspective about the Nissen huts. And also the social history that's attached to them, particularly around migration, is becoming more and more important and more recognised. So hopefully over time, community attitudes and values change slightly, that eventually leads to greater protection for the remaining ones.